The hum of the television filled the silence that had long settled between us. It was always on, morning news, evening dramas, late-night reruns, its flickering light the only pulse left in our quiet house. My husband, Kamal, sat beside me, his attention buried deep in his phone, fingers scrolling endlessly through a world that didn't include me. I could have disappeared right then, and he wouldn't have noticed until breakfast. I used to talk during these evenings, small things, mostly. Work gossip, a funny ad, a recipe that turned out well. But after enough half-hearted nods and distracted, my words dried up. Now, we shared only space, not moments. That night began like every other. The TV droned on, Kamal barely looked up, and I folded laundry just to fill the air with sound. Then the doorbell rang. It was Farhad, Kamal's friend from the office. I had met him a few times before, always in passing. He had that casual warmth some people carry naturally, the kind that makes them easy to talk to. He smiled politely when I opened the door, holding a USB drive in his hand. "Need Kamal to transfer a few files," he said. Kamal barely looked up. "Just leave it on the table," he muttered, eyes still on his phone. Farhad hesitated, then noticed the show on TV. "You still watch The Open Window?" he asked me. I nodded, surprised he remembered. "Sometimes. It helps the evenings feel shorter." He smiled faintly and sat on the edge of the couch while waiting for Kamal to plug in the drive. "I used to watch this with my sister. She said the main character reminded her of me, always running away from things he doesn't understand." The line lingered longer than it should have. I didn't know why, but his tone, half amused, half wistful, stirred something small and restless inside me. After he left, I thought little of it. But the next evening, he stopped by again, this time to return the drive. Kamal wasn't home yet, so he stayed for a few minutes. We watched a few minutes of The Open Window, shared brief comments, and then he left. Simple, harmless. The third time, it was raining. He appeared at the door holding 2 cups of tea from the nearby cafe. "They messed up the order. Thought I'd bring one over," he said with an easy grin. The tea was too sweet, but I didn't tell him. It felt kind, thoughtful in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Kamal came home later, noticed the extra cup, and asked nothing. Maybe he didn't care. Maybe that was what hurt most. Days turned into a quiet pattern. Some evenings Farhad dropped by, always with a reason, a flash drive, a movie recommendation, a casual, just passing through. We didn't talk much, sometimes we didn't need to. The sound of the TV filled the gaps, but somehow, those silences felt alive. Once, he laughed at a line before I did, as if anticipating my reaction. Our eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, something unspoken passed between us. Familiarity, maybe, recognition, or just the quiet ache of 2 people who understood loneliness too well. I told myself it was nothing. Just company, just someone sitting beside me while the world dimmed quietly around us. But later, as Kamal snored softly in the next room and the TV light flickered against the empty couch, I caught myself smiling at the thought of how Farhad had laughed, how he'd noticed the same things I did. It was nothing, yet somehow, it had already begun to mean something. And that was when I realized, sometimes, betrayal doesn't arrive loudly. It slips in quietly, during commercials, between sentences, while someone is just watching TV with you. Farhad's visits became part of the rhythm of my evenings, though neither of us ever spoke of it as such. There was no arrangement, no messages exchanged. He would simply appear, sometimes with tea, sometimes with a small joke or a story about his day. Always casual, always unassuming. At first, I told myself it was coincidence. But soon, I found myself expecting that knock at the door. I would start the kettle a little earlier, straighten the cushions, adjust my hair though no one else would notice. When he didn't come, the silence felt heavier than usual, like the house itself was disappointed. Kamal noticed nothing, or perhaps, he noticed and didn't care. His world remained the same, emails, calls, the glow of his phone screen. Once, when Farhad arrived and Kamal was home, the two spoke briefly about work. Farhad left after 10 minutes, and I felt the strange disappointment of a conversation that ended too soon. That night, when Kamal reached for me in bed, his touch felt distant, mechanical. I turned to face the wall, pretending to be asleep. The next evening, Farhad came by again. We didn't watch the show this time. The power had gone out, so we sat in the faint light from a candle on the coffee table. He told me about his childhood, how his father used to fix old radios just to hear music from broken things. I laughed softly and told him about my mother, who could never sleep without a fan humming beside her. Little stories, simple things, but they made the room feel alive. When the lights came back on, neither of us moved immediately. The candle flickered once, then went out. We stared at the TV screen, its sudden brightness almost too sharp. I realized how easy it was to forget myself in those moments, how natural it felt to exist in someone else's quiet. After that night, our conversations deepened. He asked about my job, about the things I liked, about books I hadn't mentioned in years. He listened, truly listened, in a way Kamal hadn't done since before our wedding. I caught myself smiling more easily, laughing without guilt, speaking without rehearsing what to say. But it wasn't innocent anymore, not entirely. The way our eyes lingered too long, the quiet pauses between words, they carried weight neither of us dared acknowledge. One evening, while reaching for the remote, our hands brushed. It was nothing, a fleeting touch, but the spark that followed felt too real to ignore. I pulled my hand back, heart racing, pretending to fix the cushion beside me. Neither of us spoke for the rest of the show. After he left, I sat staring at the paused screen, the characters frozen mid-sentence. I realized my own life had become the same, stuck between moments, afraid to move forward yet unwilling to step back. That night, lying beside Kamal, I thought of Farhad's hand near mine, of the way the air had seemed to hold its breath. I told myself it was just loneliness playing tricks, that I was reading too much into kindness. But deep down, I knew better. There was a difference between needing company and craving connection, and I had crossed that line quietly, almost willingly. The next day, when Farhad came by, we didn't turn on the TV. He handed me a book he thought I'd like. "You said you used to read poetry," he reminded me. I opened it later, alone, and found a line underlined in pencil. "Sometimes, the heart finds comfort where it shouldn't linger." I stared at the words until they blurred, realizing I was already too far gone. Because it wasn't about the TV anymore. It was about being seen, by someone who wasn't supposed to look that closely. The distance between what was right and what felt right had grown dangerously thin. Each evening, I told myself I would not wait for him. Yet every creak of the gate, every passing shadow beyond the window, sent a quiet thrill through me. Sometimes he came, sometimes he didn't. But the wanting never left. When he did appear, things felt different, tense, uncertain. We still sat on the same couch, still shared the same quiet laughter, but the air between us had changed. Words came slower, glances stayed longer. The unspoken had begun to speak for itself. Kamal, meanwhile, had started to notice something. It wasn't that I looked different or acted differently, it was that I seemed alive again. He asked one evening, almost carelessly, "You've been smiling a lot lately. What's new?" I froze for a moment too long. "Just the show," I said, forcing a laugh. "It's getting interesting." He nodded, unconvinced, and returned to his phone. But the question lingered in the air, a small crack in the wall of secrecy I had built. A few nights later, Farhad arrived when Kamal wasn't home yet. We sat watching a rerun neither of us really followed. At one point, the silence between us grew so thick it demanded to be broken. "I shouldn't come here so often," he said quietly. "People might start talking." My heart stuttered. "People? Or you?" He looked at me then, really looked. "Both," he admitted. "I don't want to hurt you." It was the first time he'd said something that acknowledged what had been silently growing between us. The words felt heavier than I expected. I wanted to tell him I understood, that I didn't blame him, but my throat tightened, and all I managed was a faint, "We're just friends." He gave a small, almost sorrowful smile. "Yeah," he said, "just friends." That night, when Kamal came home early, he found us sitting on the couch. The TV played softly. The distance between us was small, too small, perhaps, for innocence to claim. His eyes flickered between us, confusion clouded by exhaustion. Didn't know we had company, he said flatly. Farhad stood quickly. I was just leaving. Kamal nodded, his gaze never leaving me. Don't let me stop you. When the door closed behind him, the silence that followed was unbearable. Kamal didn't shout. He didn't ask questions. He simply sat down, picked up the remote, and turned up the volume. The sound of the show filled the room, loud and meaningless. For the first time, I wished the TV would break. Later that night, he spoke. You think I don't notice things, he said quietly. But I do. I just stopped asking. I didn't know what to say. Apologies felt dishonest, explanations sounded hollow. He turned away before I could respond, leaving me alone with the noise of the television and the weight of everything unspoken. Days passed without a visit from Farhad. No texts, no excuses. Just absence, a hollow space that echoed louder than his presence ever had. I waited for the knock that never came. Each evening, I found myself turning the TV on out of habit, letting its artificial light fill the void he left behind. I had thought I wanted to be seen, but now I only felt exposed. It wasn't love, not really. It wasn't even an affair in the traditional sense. It was something smaller and more dangerous, an ache that had turned into a habit. One night, as the opening music of The Open Window played again, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I watched it for the story. It had only ever been a backdrop, a screen behind which I hid from my own loneliness. And now, there was no one left sitting beside me. Just me, and the flickering light of a TV that finally showed me what I'd become. The living room feels larger now. Quieter. The couch where we used to sit seems to belong to someone else's life, two shadows who mistook silence for comfort. The television still stands across from me, but I rarely turn it on anymore. When I do, it only reminds me of what I lost, and of what I never truly had. Kamal and I still share this house. We move through it like ghosts of our former selves, polite, predictable, careful not to collide. He doesn't ask where my mind drifts, and I don't ask where he finds his peace. We exist side by side, as if pretending that routine could patch the spaces emotion once filled. Sometimes I wonder if he knows the whole truth, or if he's simply chosen not to. Perhaps he understands that what happened was not physical, that the betrayal lived in the quiet exchanges, in the comfort of another person's presence. Maybe that hurts more. I've thought about reaching out to Farhad, though I never have. His absence has become its own kind of punishment, a silence that demands I face myself. I tell myself it ended before it truly began, that no vows were broken, no lies told. But then I remember how I waited for him, how my heart leapt at the sound of his voice. And I know better. It's strange how easily something ordinary can turn into a threshold. A couch, a cup of tea, a shared laugh. You cross without realizing, until the ground feels different beneath your feet. What begins as loneliness-seeking comfort becomes desire-seeking validation, and by the time you notice, it's too late to turn back. Sometimes I replay that final night, the way Kamal looked at me, the flicker of realization in his eyes. It wasn't anger I saw there. It was disappointment, not in me, but in the distance he'd allowed to grow. That's the cruelty of silence, it doesn't announce its damage until the harm is already done. I've stopped blaming him, though. It's too easy to place the weight of our emptiness on someone else. The truth is, I drifted. I wanted to feel seen, and I chose the first light that noticed me. I told myself it was harmless because nothing physical happened. But affection, I've learned, doesn't need touch to betray. It just needs attention given to the wrong person. Last night, I turned the TV on for the first time in weeks. The same show was airing, The Open Window, the one Farhad and I used to watch. I sat through it alone, the scenes familiar but stripped of warmth. At the end, the main character said a line I'd never noticed before. Some doors are meant to stay closed, even when they look like windows. I let the credits roll without moving, the glow of the screen soft against my face. For the first time, I didn't feel longing. I felt clarity, sharp, humbling, almost cleansing. When I turned the TV off, the silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt honest. Kamal came in a few minutes later, looked at me sitting there, and asked softly, "Everything okay?" I met his gaze for the first time in months and nodded. Getting there. He didn't smile, but he sat beside me, keeping a respectful distance. For a brief second, I wondered if this quiet, uncertain attempt, was what forgiveness looked like. Not grand gestures or second chances, but simply staying in the same room without turning away. The television remained off, and in its place was something more fragile, more real, a silence that didn't hide, a space that didn't ache. He was just watching TV with me again once. That's how it started. Now, I choose the silence instead. Because sometimes, peace isn't found in what returns, but in what you finally let go.